Welcome. And happy birthday, Mom. I hope you're enjoying this birthday party. Luncheon co-chairs, dear friends, Maria DeVos, Liesl Meyer, archivist David Ferriero, and welcome back, David. Lena Meyer, trustees and staff of Dad's Presidential Foundation and Museum, ladies and gentlemen. Please permit me, before we begin, to express our sadness for the death of Margaret Thatcher.
A lot of people may not have known if they've been here.
As Maria and Liesl can attest, events like this don't just magically happen. They take months of careful planning and care, and that planning and care are very apparent here today. Anita McBride and Joe Calvaruso, for all that you've done for the First Lady's tribute to make it a reality. Thank you. Would you two please stand? I'd also like to welcome another dear friend, a remarkable public servant. And Dad often remarked that his greatest legacy was watching those men and women who served in the White House and the administration, who then went on to give further distinguished service to the American people. With us today is a shining example of Dad's pride. He was a member of my dad's White House staff, and he later served 3 presidents. He is now the outstanding executive director of the George H.W. Bush Presidential Foundation. Fred Mcclure, would you please stand?
Fred.
Yay!
Yay, Fred.
Yay, Fred! Looking for the governor.
This is a wonderful afternoon here in Grand Rapids, even though it's raining. But it is a particular honor for me to host 2 extraordinary women who, with their family, have a decades-long special relationship with Dad, Mom, and our family. I've thought a lot about how to eloquently describe the depth of our friendship and love between the Bush and the Ford families. Ladies and gentlemen, it has not been an easy task. As many of you here recall, in the twilight of his life, Dad often remarked, "When I wake up at night, I think of Grand Rapids." Then Dad would say, one thing always happened. He and Mom would get great big smiles on their face. Mrs. Bush and Laura, as I reflected on this special friendship between our 2 families, my thoughts keep coming back to that single image of those smiles of Mother and Dad. I recall fondly Dad's state visit to China in 1975, as Mom and I accompanied Dad down the steps of Air Force One. Those on the tarmac were our dear friends, Dad's then special representative to China, George H.W. Bush and Mrs. Bush. Mom and Dad's smiles that day remind us of the entire trip, and they stayed with them the entire time for the visit, for the personal kindnesses and care of our dear friends, Mrs. Bush and her husband.
Sweet.
And through the years, the friendship between the Bush family and the Ford family has grown even stronger, year after year, decade after decade. I remember you, Laura, and the President hosted the White House in 2003 to celebrate Dad's 90th birthday. It was a wonderful evening, and the Ford family and the Bush family were together again. And yes, that entire evening, you and the President, Mother and Dad's unmistakable smiles were always present. In 2006, Dad passed away, and those several days of the state funeral were difficult indeed. But they were especially difficult for my mother. But one afternoon that week, while we were in Washington, Mrs. Bush and Laura came to the Blair House, and both Presidents Bush to visit Mother. No fanfare, no entourage, just 4 friends who were also presidents and first ladies, coming to the Blair House to comfort my mom, to comfort a friend. And the four of them visited with Mother for quite a while. And then quietly, I came into the room and joined them. And amidst a sea of sadness, there were the Bushes with Mom, and yes, for the first time in days, a smile on her face, and all of our faces too. I will always cherish my memory of that afternoon. I will never forget those smiles, and most of all, I will never forget the friendship and love from the Bush family that our smiles that day will always represent. Thus, it is a personal joy and honor to welcome to Grand Rapids two remarkable women of compassion, of impeccable integrity, honesty, women of strength, humility, who my parents and I are so proud to call our dear friends, and who today have brought the Bush family and the Ford family together again. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming with, yes, a big smile, my friends, First Ladies Barbara Bush and Laura Bush.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. That was so sweet.
So let me pick up on Susan's comments about her mother. We're sitting here not far from a museum full of memories of Betty Ford. In Ann Arbor, a wonderful presidential library with the papers representing the administration. Would you share with us some of your memories of her as an individual, but also the role she played in that presidency?
Are you talking to
Both of
Mrs.
you.
Bush or Mrs. Bush?
Mrs. Bush.
I will say
I'm talking to the Mrs. Bushes.
well, there is something the Bushes and the Fords have in common, and Susan just exhibited it, and that's the not be able to make it through a speech without weeping. Well, I'll tell you when I first met Betty Ford, and that was when George and I were living in Dallas. It was the almost very first of the Komen lunches, the big luncheons that Komen for the Cure, Susan Komen, our friend Nancy Brinker, hosted right after she founded Komen, the breast cancer foundation. And every year for that big, huge luncheon, Susan, you came and your mother came. And really what it showed, and that's when I met her first, but what it showed was your mother's unbelievable courage to make something that was a tragedy for her, breast cancer, so public, so that every American woman then knew to go get a mammogram or knew what they could do to protect themselves. And we have her to thank for that. We really do. Before that, women didn't really talk about breast cancer, and women didn't really know what to do. So I'm thankful for her very strong personality, that she would use something that was a tragedy for her for the good of all of us.
I knew Betty Ford. I knew her for a long time. Jerry, Susan, your dad, worked for him, for George, when he ran for the Congress and helped him a lot. And then your mother and I were in the same international club, International Club number 2. And she stayed in that club when she was wife of the president, could not be lured to number 1. And I stayed in the club when George became president, but she was a wonderful, wonderful lady. And I knew your mother before and after her addiction problems. And she really was a lady all through them, but it was hard for her. And she was a great first lady, as Laura says, but she was a great friend. And I think your mother probably has saved more lives with the Betty Ford Foundation, and I hope she gets great pleasure from the fact that she has changed the world, not only in breast cancer, but
As Susan also mentioned, we today learned about the passing of Margaret Thatcher, and I know that you both have associations with Mrs. Thatcher, and some reflections on your part.
Well, we knew her very well. She was very opinionated. Everybody knew that. But she was wonderful. And we were with her the night she was voted out in Paris at the G7 meeting. And she was so courageous. And she said, "Don't worry, I'm going home and we will change the vote." And of course, she didn't change the vote. And I think I really think she regretted that a lot. She had a wonderful husband who was the Rock of Gibraltar and who kept her going, truthfully, very loyal and wonderful. And I had not seen Margaret for a long, long time, so anyway, she was a great lady, and will go down in history, I think, as being one of the very great prime ministers of England and maybe one of the great leaders of the world.
And a great friend to the United States. And that relationship between the British Prime Minister and the President of the United States is always really important. So she was really an example for all of us, and especially for women.
I think that's right.
So was Betty Ford, with her strong support for the ERA.
She did tell me, Margaret, after we were both voted out of office, she a little longer in office, but she said, "Don't you wish we could go back, Barbara?" I said, "No." She said, "I'd like just 4 more years." I said, "No, Margaret, I'm very, very happy. I'm not one who suffers over something you can't have." But she wanted to go back. She knew she could do better than those men. Sorry.
So let's talk about that. The changing role of First Ladies over time. I want to read you a portion of a letter written by one of your predecessors to her husband from Braintree, Massachusetts at the end of March 1776. Abigail Adams wrote, after admonishing her husband, "I wish you would ever write me a letter half as long as I write you." She goes on to say, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation."
And we finally rebelled in 1920 and got the vote.
She was ahead of her time.
She was.
Of course, she would not have been married to George Bush had she written that. Either one. Sorry.
So how has the role changed over time, even between
Well, I mean, I
the
think
two
you
of
can see that in a lot of ways it hasn't changed when you read Abigail Adams' words. I mean, I think in every case, the First Lady, the wife of the President, has really done whatever fit her personality and her interest and have always benefited the people of the United States. We benefit from that expertise and the interest of our First Ladies, I think. And so I don't think it really has changed that much. I think there obviously are First Ladies who are, more political maybe, and maybe that's what your mother was, Susan, by coming out so strongly for the Equal Rights Amendment. And I think that was really important. I remember that. I mean, that's one of the things I really remember about her. Of course, I wasn't married to George then. I wasn't at all into politics and didn't know that much about it, but I was glad that she was saying that.
It's generational.
Barr didn't want equal rights, she already had them.
That's right. No, it is generational, though. But when you look at Eleanor Roosevelt, my goodness, she made a huge impact on, I think what Laura said is right. It's each individual First Lady does her thing. I chose to do mine one way, which was to just focus on literacy and then help other things by just showing up. But literacy was my interest. But I certainly could have done much, much more, I realize now, having watched Laura, who did so much good. I mean, so much good. But can't cry over spilt milk.
So let's talk about that literacy, because you both have made very important contributions in terms of reading and the importance of children and families reading and books. And where did that come from?
Go ahead.
My dad was in the publishing business, and of course we didn't have television, but we sure had radio. But we would sit at night in our little house, my mother on one end of the couch and me on another, and my dad in his chair, and we all read. I particularly remember, because he was in the magazine business, why Saturday Evening Post ran serials, Agatha Christie, the 10 Little Indians, and we would wait each week for it to come. Then the magazine would go from Daddy'd read it on the train, Mother'd get it next, I'd get it next, but we all read.
And of course my parents weren't in the publishing business, but my mother loved to read and read to me from when I was a baby, really. And reading just became a passion of mine for the rest of my life.
So tell us a little about what you do now related to literacy. I had an opportunity within the last month to come to College Station, and 64,000 children around the world listening to
That was
Mrs.
very
Bush.
exciting.
It was.
We Skyped, and that really was amazing, because we Skyped, how many schools? I think there were 21 or 22, and we got them all the way, I think 17 in America, one in Canada, one in Nigeria. I mean, we Skyped these children, and they asked questions, and we had read to them first a book called Capital, I think. And it's just amazing. Now that is generational. I mean, my chin is on the floor over the ability to talk to people around the world. In fact, on Easter, we talked to family all around the world. Neil is smarter than I am. He Skyped them.
And you started the book festival.
I started the Texas Book Festival when George was governor, and then the National Book Festival in Washington, which is a huge success. 120,000 people turn out on the National Mall for the National Book Festival. So that's been really terrific.
And it still goes on.
Still goes on, and both of them, the Texas Book Festival as well. It's in its 18th year, I guess. And the National Book Festival still goes on. They're both very popular.
Do you do it in
Really
conjunction with the Library of Congress?
The Library of Congress is our partner for the National Book Festival, and then we just have a great committee in Texas that does it, but it's actually in the Texas State Capitol. So we use the Senate floor and the House floor for our authors that draw a big crowd with a lot of chairs, and then also the committee hearing rooms. It's the only thing besides the government that's allowed to be in the Texas, to meet like that in the Texas Capitol building. And that's been a lot of fun, to turn the Texas Capitol building over to literature for at least one weekend a year. But also now through the Bush Institute, which is part of our library that we're getting ready to open on April 25th, we have a number of education initiatives that we're working on. One on what are the best practices for recruiting and training principals. There's a lot of focus now on teachers, obviously, and there should be, because we know from research that teachers are the most influential factor in all of education. If you have a great teacher, then you're much more likely to be successful as a student. But principals are the ones who structure the school. And there are only about 130,000 principals in the United States. It's a number that we can reach out to and make sure that school districts recruit in a really good way and have training set up that's really good to help principals so that they also have the authority to do the things they need to do to make sure they structure a good school. And then our second big education program is called Middle School Matters. And we're using all of the research that shows how you can intervene in middle school. When you have kids that get there to the 6th grade or to the 7th grade who still can't read, what you can do, systematic intervention for them so that by the time they finish middle school, they're ready for high school. And you can teach a child to read easier in middle school. Their vocabulary, their spoken vocabulary is much larger because they watched a lot more television, for instance. But so we're trying to work with middle schools across the United States to make sure they have all these intervention strategies, because they say that kids drop out in middle school, they just leave in high school. So, and we, as all of you know, we have a very large dropout problem in the United States. So it's important to be able to reach kids before they get to high school. If they can't read by high school, then it's too late.
Now, while we're bragging, the Barbara Bush Foundation has been taken over by Jeb, our son, Florida son, and our daughter Doro. And Neil and his wife have taken over Houston, and Mandy and George have taken over Fort Worth and Dallas for our fundraisers. And Neil has this, he's passionate about setting up a model program in the city of Houston, which, as you all know, is fairly comfortable financially. Maybe not as much as Dallas, but they should do their part too. But anyway, this is just for Houston. He's going to the corporations and companies there and saying, because people want to give money that will help their community, so they're building a model that other cities will be able to use. And it's really very exciting because they're getting big contributions from major oil companies and major businesses, and they have definitely in place a Houston Reads program that's very successful. And actually the director of the Barbara Bush Foundation is here, Liza, and she could do a much better job than I, but she wasn't married to a president. In any case, it's a very exciting program, and if we can get it off base, and we're sort of working towards our celebration of reading that's coming up shortly, and I think that this will change America. I'm very excited about it. So any extra dollars can go to the Liza McFadden Barbara Bush Foundation. Okay.
Barbara's Foundation gives to family literacy projects around the country and in every part of the United States, big grants that go to literacy projects that include the child and the caregiver, the mother, or the dad, or the daycare
grandmother,
worker, really,
whatever.
the grandmother. Mm-hmm.
They kicked me out. They say
she retired.
Up. They say up. Anyway, they're doing a great job, and they've taken it to a whole new level, and it's very exciting for me.
One of the greatest things about the Skype adventure with the students asking questions is that each student introduced him or herself, his or her teacher, and his or her librarian.
Oh, that's great.
Very nice touch, I thought, as a librarian.
That's my foundation.
That's right. So let's talk about how one prepares. There are a lot of young people here. How does one prepare to become a First Lady?
Marry well.
Laura was a governor's wife, and as was Nancy Reagan. And it sort of amused me when Nancy came to Washington and George was vice president then. several Senate ladies had a meeting, and to tell Nancy how to be a first lady. You talk about something that went over big. She knew how to be a first lady. But I think being a governor's wife, or being a congressman's wife, or living in Washington, as George and I did, it really wasn't very scary. As president's wife made it a cinch. And it was nice for me because I knew a lot of people there, plus I had 2 children who lived there, and Laura and George came and helped us. So you spent a year there with the girls.
That's right.
And it was a wonderful opportunity. So now how Laura prepared.
Well, of course, you know how I did. I had a mother-in-law that I watched. And I learned a lot from Bar, and Bar is really pretty good about not giving her daughter-in-law's advice, because she knew she didn't really want advice from her mother-in-law. But on the other hand, we all watched her, and we learned a lot.
No, you didn't need to watch, you were
Yes.
good. But in any case, we were lucky. And it was hard for people like Nancy, who moved to Washington from California and knew nobody. And fortunately, Ronald Reagan appointed a cabinet with people from all over the country, which made it much easier for her. But it's hard. Betty Ford, she knew. It wasn't hard for her. She'd been there, and everybody loved her and knew her. So it wasn't hard for her, I don't believe. Was it, Susan?
No, I don't think it was. I mean, same with Lady Bird. We all grew up in D.C.
Yeah.
That's right. Lady Bird, because she was one of my favorites too, Lady Bird. I loved her. But she, like your mother, knew Washington. And both were generous. We'd never been upstairs at the White House till Lady Bird became the wife, and then she invited everybody up. She was wonderful. I think there were 48 new members of Congress that year, and she invited people up. But your mother was very generous in inviting people to come.
I got to show Lady Bird Johnson around the White House. She had already had a stroke, and so she didn't speak anymore. She'd lost her speech, but her daughter, Linda, brought her in a wheelchair. And when they got to the door, I met them downstairs at the South Portico, and the elevator man, the doorman, he was retired and he had just come back as a doorman, but he had been the maitre d' when the Johnsons lived there. And so when Lady Bird came up in her wheelchair, Mr. Wilson and Lady Bird fell into each other's arms. And it was really sweet. And then I showed her around the White House, and she was still so expressive. She couldn't speak, but she would put her hands out when she saw a painting or that she remembered, or it was really great to have that one chance to show her around.
Well, tell a little bit about the White House staff. They make life very easy.
Do they ever?
They don't talk
That's
about...
who we miss the most. The chef.
But they don't talk about your predecessors. We never heard how awful Susan was or anything. I mean, they really don't. And it makes you very comforted, I think. And they're the same ones were there when George became president. Why, George and I went back and fell into the arms
That's
of the
right.
same
Exactly.
people.
And that was really a huge advantage for us too, because we did already know the staff, the permanent staff, the butlers and the ushers and the people that are there for 4 or 5 presidents. And so that was fun when we moved into the White House, that we already knew everyone that worked there. And they'll all be coming for the opening of the library on April 25th. We're getting the RSVPs from them. And
It's nice.
they all look forward to it. I remember when they all came to, when President Bush's library opened, George was governor of Texas. So of course we were there. We would have been there anyway, but he was
hope
there in
so.
his official role as governor, and we got to see all the waiters and butlers and
They had the
ushers at your library as well.
horseshoe tournament.
Yeah,
they
that's
beat the boys again.
Yeah.
But it makes such a difference to have a house that feels like a home, and I think that's something people don't realize about the White House.
That it does really feel like
It feels
home.
very much like a home.
So what role then did Crawford and Kennebunkport play in your lives?
Well, they were a wonderful escape, for one thing, for us to be able to go to the ranch, which is what we did for our vacations in August. When the Congress went away, we'd go to the ranch, and it was our own home with our own things, but also we could walk outside. You know, it really gave us a chance to be outside that you don't really have at the White House, although I did every once in a while get up and go for really early morning walks on the mall with friends when friends were in town, especially if the cherry blossoms were blooming. One time I was walking on the mall early in the morning. We stopped at the Roosevelt Monument to go into the restrooms, and a woman said, "You know, you look just like Laura Bush." But the ranch gave us both a chance to be outside in a way that we couldn't any other time of the year, and gave us a wonderful way to host heads of state. And we had, I think, at least a dozen heads of state to the ranch. In fact, when George invited Jiang Zemin from China to Washington, or invited him to the United States to visit us in the United States, at the press conference, he said, President Bush invited me to the ranch, which George hadn't, but of course then we did invite him to the ranch. And that was fun.
That's about the same for Kennebunkport.
Exactly.
But we think of Kennebunkport, I think, mostly as family. It's a great family place.
But it is also a wonderful place to host heads of state, and we had 2 heads of state visit us in Kennebunkport. Yeah, right. President Putin and President Sarkozy from from France, both.
And you remember what President Sarkozy said? I am an American or something, which wasn't very popular at home, but we loved it. And Putin was such a good guest. And then he went home and was sort of mean.
Well, exactly. He was a good guest.
He was a great guest. I mean, he went fishing. He didn't take any times off. He was charming. Even told several slightly off-colored jokes. I had to ask.
Through an interpreter.
I had to ask Conde Rice, is she interpreting that correctly? Because she spoke Russian. She said, yes. But he lost some of his charm.
Evidently.
So you heard it here, Putin is kind of mean.
Well, not to us, but
No.
his people at home. You go his way or you don't go.
And what about Camp David?
Well, Camp David the same. We love going to Camp David. We have a family record that no one will ever be able to break of having spent 12 Christmases at Camp David.
That's right.
Because we spent the 4, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. The 4 years that President Bush was president, the whole family went to Camp David, and then the 8 years that George was president, everyone came to Camp David for Christmas. And
that brings up another point, which you probably should know. I think you all think, oh, they had this big family, 32 people that George W. charged to the government. That is not true. Every meal that you eat that's private, he paid for, or my husband paid for. That is not something that the government paid for. So they've granted an egg, they put down the thing, 1 egg, 18 cents, or something. Your guest ate 2 pieces of toast. But it is not on the government. And in fairness to any president, you ought to know that the president himself, or if he has a rich wife, she pays for it. They didn't, did they?
What's that?
They didn't have a rich wife, either one of them.
No,
they paid for it.
Neither George. Neither Georges had a rich wife, had rich wives.
One of the nicest things that you did, Laura, was to invite the directors of the presidential libraries to Camp David. They're still talking about it.
That's great.
Even those who weren't there, have been hired since, are talking about it. What a great opportunity it was.
I did a historical photograph collection for Camp David to put up in the different cabins, because every president since Franklin Roosevelt, who is the one who picked Camp David as the presidential retreat, had entertained heads of state at Camp David. And so I worked with the presidential libraries because, of course, the first presidential library was Franklin Roosevelt's, and asked for historical photographs from their archives of the president with the head of state that they hosted. So we have great pictures of President Roosevelt with Churchill and other ones. So after I did that and had worked with all the presidential libraries to get these photographs for Camp David, then I invited all of the directors of the libraries, because none of them had been to Camp David. Some of them may know the principal of their library, and some of them, of course, don't know, never knew the president who they serve now. And so I wanted them to come see Camp David. And so we had a great tour of Camp David, and then we had lunch in the lodge, Laurel, where all the meals are. And I got to ask them everything about building a library. And they were very forthcoming. It was really great. I mean, they would say, well, be sure to do this, and don't do this. We made this mistake. And it was very helpful to hear all of their advice before we started working on building our presidential library.
So we are on the eve of
That's right.
opening
That's
the
right.
third presidential library in Texas. So you can't be as excited as I am, because this is my first.
Well, this is my first too.
But talk about, as the first lady, the first mother, you know, this is a gorgeous, gorgeous library.
It's a beautiful library, and it's been really fun to work on. I've been on the design committee. We chose Bob Stern as our architect, who's the dean of the Yale Architecture School, and our library is on my alma mater, the campus of Southern Methodist University. So our architect was sort of a nod to George, since he's from Yale, and then built on my campus, SMU in Dallas, at a subway stop. We'll be the only really urban, in that sense, on Central Expressway in Dallas presidential library. And we have a big park. SMU was very generous in giving us a lot of acreage, and so we have a 15-acre park, all planted in Texas native plants and prairie grass. And we just received our LEED Platinum, which is the highest LEED designation, and part of the reason is because of the way we both landscaped with native plants, but also we have a 250,000-gallon cistern. We collect all the runoff from the building, both rainwater runoff as well as air conditioner condensation runoff. All the water from the building is collected in this cistern, and we can use it to irrigate the park. And then, of course, the park is planted in Texas native, so it won't need as much irrigation as other plantings would. And we worked with the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center to develop the grass that is the turf grass in the park, that is a mixture of 4 Texas native grasses, so it won't need to be watered very often or mowed very often. So we're very excited about it. It's going to be really terrific. And of course, the museum is being installed as fast as they can install it right now, so it'll be ready to open on April 25th. I hope you all will all come. I hope you'll come sometime down to Dallas and then go over to College Station and visit our libraries.
And you can even go to LBJ.
That's right.
Okay.
You can go to 3 in
Do a
one
little
state.
circle thing.
So why are the, I could talk all afternoon about this, but from your perspective, why are the presidential libraries important?
Well, I think what they really are is a history of those years in, but of course around one presidency. So for us, ours is the history of the first decade of the new century, and of course a very important part of ours is September 11th. Mm-hmm. And we just, most of the installation is in, and so I just walked through with friends again, and George walked through with some friends and their children, and realized when he walked through the September 11th part of our museum that the children didn't have any memory of it.
Oh.
Already. We're that far away. We're 12 years away from it, and so people will forget. And I think that's what's really important about these presidential libraries, our presidential libraries in the U.S., is they are really history museums, and it's important for us. They're both history and civics and government museums, and I think it's important for young people to both learn our history, and they can learn it through a museum like our presidential libraries, but also to learn about our government and how our government runs, and what it means that our presidents come from the people the way they do. So I think they serve a great model as history museums. And not every part of the country obviously has a presidential museum, but they're much more likely to have, most cities, to have some sort of art museum and not a history museum necessarily. So I think that's one good service.
I remember going to visit an unnamed president's library and coming home and saying to George, golly, you'd have thought he was the greatest president in the world.
Let me
And
see,
George
which
said,
one would that
never
be?
mind. And George said, that's what presidential libraries are for heaven's sakes.
Well, I will have to say George did not say that, because George said
George said that.
I know, my George did not say that. He said, don't make this a monument to me. He said, that isn't what it is. He said, if it's all only based on a personality, then over time, it'll lose its meaning. The point, it's a monument to our country, really, is what it is, and the executive office, and not the person necessarily. So we knew that, and we had that in mind the whole time we built it.
You went to the same library, obviously.
Yeah. No, I didn't.
So say a few words about the Institute, because one of the nicest things about this new presidential library is that the Institute got up and running as soon as the administration was
That's
over.
right. Well, so as part of it, we built an institute, a policy institute. We're out of politics, but we're still interested in policy. And so the Policy Institute is focusing in 4 policy areas that were the most important to us when George was president. And as you might guess, there's an overriding theme of freedom. Freedom from ignorance, our education initiative. Freedom from disease, our global health initiative. Promoting the free market, our economic initiative. And then human freedom, freedom from tyranny. And running through that in all 4 policy areas is a women's initiative. So we have great projects going. We're very focused. We're not going to have a lot of projects, but we're going to have very successful ones. And one is the Global Health Initiative, is the pink ribbon, red ribbon. And our partners are Susan G. Komen for the Cure, the U.S. State Department, UN AIDS, and then a lot of the drug companies that make the vaccine for the HP virus. We're using the PEPFAR platform that was set up across Africa for AIDS while George was president, and adding the testing and treatment for cervical cancer and breast cancer to the AIDS platform. Women across Africa are living now with AIDS because they're on ARVs, but they're dying of cervical cancer. It's the leading cause of cancer death in Africa. And as you know, in the United States, you never hear of anyone with cervical cancer because pap smears are such a regular part of every physical. So we're adding that, and then the drug companies that have joined us are giving the vaccine to these countries so that girls can be vaccinated against the HB virus.
Wonderful.
And so that's just one example. I told you already about the principals and the middle school matters. Those are our 2 education initiatives. And then we have a terrific women's initiative. We have a women's fellowship. This is in partnership with SMU. An SMU professor did research and found out that a woman's success, the greatest indicator of a woman's success is her network, and more than her education level. And women in some parts of the world are isolated, not able really to have a network like we are free to have in the United States. And so we have brought women from Egypt for 2 years. Our second group of Egyptian women fellows just went home last Friday. And the professor's idea was that if you bring women on a fellowship all from the same country, then when they go home, they have each other. And then they can introduce each other to their colleagues and their families, and they broaden their network really pretty quickly. So these Egyptian women fellows have come. They've learned to do things taught by business school professors about how to make their life plans, how to negotiate without authority, which is, when you think of it, what a lot of women have to do. A lot of other things about making their life plans and their business plans. And then they've gone to Washington. Anita, I think, hosted them when they were just in Washington. They went to New York. I rang the opening bell on the stock exchange with them last year. Then they went to the Silicon Valley to Google and Facebook and Twitter and all the things that are making these revolutions that we're seeing so much easier now, being able to get above a tyrannical government through social media. And then they went off to a dozen different cities with American women mentors who are there in their same professions, and then they just have gone home. But the fellowship lasts a year, so they stay in constant contact through the internet and Skype with their mentors. And then the SMU professors go to Egypt in the middle of the 6-month period to do more training and to follow the women to see what they need after they've been there for back home for a year. George and I believe that women will lead the democracy movement across the Middle East. And we want to help them build the civil institutions, the civic institutions that they need to support a democracy that we inherited and that we're so lucky we inherited.
Aren't you proud of her?
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
We have a lot of visitors at the National Archives, but the Egyptian women for the past 2 years have really asked the best questions. They're
And
really
they
interested in the records.
Spoke about it at the end, to actually be able to see a copy of our Constitution. They really like that.
What's the toughest decision you had to make as First Lady?
We can't think of any.
What?
What's your toughest decision?
I heard the question. I don't know the answer. What's the toughest decision?
We didn't have to make them. That was the people we were married to made
I
those
think-
decisions.
How you comfort your husband when they're sending people to war is not easy. And that's hard. I think that's probably the hardest.
I'd say how you comfort a nation.
Then, well, you
after
comforted the
something
nation.
like September 11th. I mean, how you even respond to both emotionally and, intellectually to something like that is tough. And then war.
War is not
Tough.
easy.
We have a lot of young people in the room. What advice would you give them about a career in public service?
Yes,
That's right. Go for it.
go for it. But in anything you do in life, you do your best. You work hard. You don't think you're entitled. I'm very proud of all our grandchildren because they're doing all sorts of public service, whether they're running for office or whether they're working for charities. I mean, Laura's girls have been wonderful. Barbara has the global health program. She went to Yale, she says, to be an architect, but she traveled with her parents and saw children dying of things they shouldn't die of and changed her focus in life. And she's now, tell about global health.
So Barbara has Global Health Corps, which recruits young, smart college graduates to work in the health field. And she has her third group of Global Health Corps fellows right now in 5 countries in Africa and 3 cities in the U.S. There are some on the Global Health desk at the State Department. And there are 2 young architects in Rwanda who are helping design the ventilation system for a Partners in Health hospital. There's a kid who worked for the Gap and did supply chain management for the Gap who work for the Tanzanian Ministry of Health to set up their procurement and supply chain management for drugs to get out to their clinics for ARVs. And she's just doing great. And Jenna is on the Today Show. I hope you all have seen her sometime. George says she's just continuing the Bush family tradition of warm relations with the media.
Now,
They're doing great.
Lauren has a feed program. She's fed 68 million children around the world and has just made a deal with Target, and they're going to sell different items made by women around the world who heretofore had no way to make any money. And they'll make the bag, the feed bag, or the bracelet, or whatever they're selling at Target. And that money will go to feed American children. It's shocking to me to see how many children are hungry in America. And so she's doing that. Pierce works for Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and Ellie works for the Conan Foundation. I mean, they're all doing something for others. So when you ask, should you get into public service? Yes, you should. And you should do something that will help others, whether it's going to call on some nice old lady like me who's lonely or something. I'm not lonely, don't call on me.
Never mind.
I mean, there are people who, you know, if you know someone is lonely, you should call on them. You should help someone get their child to school. There are a lot of things you can do that are not due to public office or to elected office, but are just nice things that help clothe people or do whatever there is out there. And there's a lot out there that needs help. Maybe the economy's coming back, but there are sure a lot of people who are hurting in our country. And you can help them, and you should do that. I love the way so many colleges now are taking a day to build housing and build Habitat for Humanity, or it's just wonderful. But that's what you should do, and that's public service, I think.
Absolutely.
Read to somebody. Jeb, as governor, read to someone once a week, the whole 8 years he was governor. We mentored a child once a week at lunchtime. You can do that. In fact, it wouldn't have hurt me to give up a lunch or two.
Well, thank you for your lives in public service.
Thank
and
you,
thank you
David.
for sharing your thoughts with us
Thank you.
this afternoon.
Thank